grab your sword, saddle your horse, and offer a prayer to Crom, because today on Dragon's Teeth we're going adventuring in the Hyborian Age. Actually, don't bother with the Crom bit because he never really listens. Hi there, I'm Rob Poynton. Thanks for joining me in the library today. I'm in the library because I'm reviewing a book. It's the latest Conan pastiche novel, Conan, the Blood of the Serpent by S.M. Stirling. This actually came out in September 23, so about a year ago. It's taken me that long to get a copy and get around to reading it. I'm sure, like many of you, my to-read pile is of cyclopean proportions. But I have got around to reading it now, so as a long-time Conan fan, I thought I'd let you know my thoughts. I'm sure you're all familiar with Conan as a character, but I wonder which version of Conan you're most familiar with. Conan was created by the Texan writer Robert E. Howard, who was active in the 20s and 30s, and of course he was one of the big three names in pulp fiction, weird tales genre, alongside Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft. And the three of them were good friends. They were correspondents, they swapped ideas, and you find their fiction often overlaps in various ways. Although Conan is the most well-known of Howard's creations, is by no means the only one, Howard developed quite a wide range of different characters: Bran MacMorn, King Cole, Solomon Kane, Red Sonja Rogatino, Sailor Steve Costigan, Dark Agnes, and generally these characters were put either into historical fiction or into the sword and sorcery genre. And to my mind at least, Howard is the father of modern sword and sorcery. So I suppose I was lucky in that my first exposure to Conan came when my dad brought this very book home in about 1974, 75 maybe, Conan the Adventurer, with that iconic Frazetta cover. And after he'd read it, I read it and got hooked straight away. From there, the next adaptation I saw of Howard's work was in the Marvel comics. At that time we had the Savage Sword of Conan coming over from the States and Conan the Barbarian comic being put out in the UK as well. And this also, another relic from the 70s, 1975 Treasury edition Conan the Barbarian. I still have my copy of that. And I bring this up for a particular reason, because there are two adaptations in here that I think rank as among the best graphic adaptations, at least, of Conan stories. The first is Rogues in the House, and the second is Red Nowls, both by the wonderful Barry Windsor Smith, one of my favourite artists. Now, this is relevant because The Blood of the Serpent has been written as a direct sequel to Red Nowls. Probably the most well-known adaptation of Conan is the 1982 movie Conan the Barbarian, starring Arnie, of course, as I'm sure everyone knows. And this to me is where the problems start, because although as a sword and sorcery movie I think that ranks as one of the best, as a Conan movie I didn't think it fared so well for a number of reasons. The origin story was totally at odds with Howard's vision, and I think the character as portrayed by Arnie, or Milius really, the writer, was a far cry from Howard's brooding, intelligent, and at times quite poetic character. There's a lot of good writing in Howard, and it gets reduced a little bit in that movie, I think, to grunts and groans and that kind of thing. However, as I say, it's a great sword and sorcery movie. I think 2 years later they made Conan the Destroyer, which started this downward trend. There was a TV version. Ralph Muller played Conan in that, which I'm not even going to talk about. And in 2011, I was excited to see the Jason Momoa Conan the Barbarian film come out, but deeply disappointed when I saw it. As a sword and sorcery movie, it didn't work. The plot was all over the place. It was a mishmash of things. And again, despite some glimpses of Momoa perhaps being able to portray an accurate Conan character, at the end of the day, I say it was just a mess and quite a disappointment. There have been numerous pastiches of Conan in the written form, starting with people like Linklater and L. Sprague de Camp. And some of my favourites of those include Carl Edward Wagner with The Road of Kings, Andrew J. Offutt, The Sword of Skelos, and Paul Anderson also did a good job as well, I thought. There are quite a few others, so if you are a Conan fan and you haven't seen any of those pastiches or adaptations, do check them out. Conan continued in graphic novel form as well. Dark Horse in 2004 started a series, which was very good. I really like that. Some great art in there, and they did a very good job of adapting and sort of filling out the original stories. However, that sort of went into decline and eventually petered out after a few years. But there are still Conan comics and graphic novels being produced today. In fact, I believe they just relaunched Savage Sword of Conan, so I shall be getting a copy of that at some point and having a look. And as I alluded to earlier with the Arnie portrayal, I think that is really what set the tone for, particularly in the 80s, this sort of dumb barbarian trope or stereotype. And of course there was a whole raft of films that followed that with the incredibly huge pneumatic guys all oiled up and less than stellar plots. Which again, if you've read the original Howard, they tend to have very strong plot lines, very strong characters, and the dialogue crackles with life, which is not something you see in most of those barbarian films. So, I was very interested to hear of this new novel coming out, Conan, Blood of the Serpent by S.M. Stirling. So I just want to say a couple of things before we get into the book itself. One is, as an author, writer, creator myself, I don't like to unnecessarily criticise other authors. I know how difficult it is to get a book written and everything else. However, I will offer my opinion. So any critique here is from a good place, if you like. These are my thoughts on the work. The other thing is, if you're going to try and emulate someone like a Howard or Lovecraft or Smith, those are very big boots to fill. And there's very few authors around today, I think, who can manage to do that. It's a very high bar. And I say that as a writer who has attempted my own, well, not pastiche of Conan, but certainly very much an homage to Howard and the character in my Wolf Who Would Be King Sword and Sorcery series. I think there's 7 volumes of those out now. I'm going to be working on the 8th within the next couple of months, starting that. So it's basically a very Conan-esque character, but it's my take on it, and I'm pleased to say that's gotten some good feedback. I've had some good reviews of those. Some people have said some nice things, which has made me happy, but I would never say that that was up to Howard's level, of course. But if you do enjoy this type of sword and sorcery, then please do go and check those out. So I don't think anyone would expect someone to be able to write at the same level as Howard, for example, or particularly people like Clark Ashton Smith, who I mentioned, who was an incredible writer. That fact often gets overlooked because we go back to that dumb barbarian thing, or, oh, they were just writing for pulps. But I think if you look at and actually analyse their work, there's a lot more substance there than people might at first think. S.M. Stirling is a Canadian author, now living in New Mexico, I believe, and I wasn't at all familiar with his work, though I believe he has put out quite a large amount of books. Most of his work, as far as I can see, is in sort of time travel, alternative history, and urban fantasy genres, and regardless of anything else, I will be interested in reading some of his other work after reading this book. So it's published by Titan Books, very nicely produced. It's about 440 pages, quite large print size, so smaller print size it could have maybe been less pages, but it is a nice size. This is terrible these days. One of my criteria for buying a book now is how big is it. You know, if it's this big and 800 pages, it's too heavy to read in bed. So I tend to go for something more compact. Also for storage reasons, because when you've got, I don't know, 800 books, you know, space gets a little bit limited. So it's very nicely produced, and it has some illustrations in here as well. These are illustrations by Roberto de la Torre, and very nicely done. These certainly put me in mind of the old artwork from Savage Sword of Conan and similar. The first 330 pages or so are the Blood of the Serpent story, and then the last just over 100 pages are Howard's original Red Nails. So we have the sequel running directly into the next story. And that's nice because it's the original Howard text, so that's good to see that. However, this does create a bit of a problem, I think, because you then have a sort of direct side-by-side comparison. And as I say, that's a very difficult one for any writer to step up to. So let's get into the story itself. So if you're familiar with Red Nails, you'll know the setup here. Conan has joined a group of mercenaries in a town called Serpent in the south of Stygia. While there, he meets Valeria of the Red Brotherhood, who's a former pirate. She has a run-in with a Stygian noble who makes unwanted advances, shall we put it like that, and ends up killing him. This, of course, attracts the attention of the Stygian authorities and friends and family of the murdered noble. Valeria is forced to flee south. She is pursued by a person bent on revenge, and Conan, who's taken a shine to Valeria, pursues the pursuer. So we've got this extended chase scene, if you like, all the way down to the city of Zucotl, where Red Nails takes place. This being Stygia, we also have a priest of Set thrown in for good measure, who's chucking curses around, which leads to a lot of Conan's difficulties and problems throughout his journey. So let's look first at some of the things I liked about the story. I think the first thing is, for me, he captured the characters of Conan and Valeria very well. This felt like a decent Conan, certainly not like the movie versions or some of those other pastiches, but I thought he captured the essence of the character, or both characters, very well. The writing overall is good, it's very clear, and it started strongly with this setting of Serpent, this mercenary company in a strange land. It's a very hot, deserty kind of place. The locals have very strange or very different customs, particularly religious customs, and you have to be very careful not to fall foul of those, because punishment for outsiders can be extremely harsh. So I thought the opening chapter or so really captured that atmosphere very nicely, of a group of disparate mercenaries from all over the place huddled together in this sort of Stygian town. And what we get with Conan here is really, it's almost like his day-to-day life as he's working in the camp, as he's doing things. They're drilling, of course. They have to hunt for food. You get a sort of slice of Conan's day-to-day life. And I think what this shows is something of the luxury that perhaps writers have today, where you can stretch out to 300 or 400 pages, or, well, however many you like. Whereas, of course, people like Howard were up against time restrictions, very often, very short time restrictions, and they were producing for a very particular market. And of course, in terms of length, when you look at a lot of these old weird fiction stories from Weird Tales, and even some old novels of the time, they're far shorter than today. You know, you can see it here. The Blood of the Serpent story is 350 pages. I think Red Nails is just over 100. So, you know, they had to pack a lot in, which maybe that works to an advantage because everything is breakneck pace. But I think it is nice as a writer, but also as a reader as well, to get a little more of the atmosphere of day-to-day what's going on. Now, although for quite a section of the story Conan is on his own because he's tracking this pursuer, he does encounter other groups and other people, and this is something I think Stirling captures well from Howard's original writing, where again these idea of disparate groups, different types of people coming together and interacting in certain ways. And I know there can be issues, and there certainly are sections of Howard that are problematic, as there were with many writers from that era, but I feel in general Howard sort of gives everyone a fair go. What sort of person you are is not necessarily dictated by where you're from. We see good and evil in characters from all of these different cultures, and I think that's something that Stirling captures here as well. So those are the positives. Now, for the negatives, I think the main one for me was this story did feel stretched out and protracted. A strong start. The ending is okay. I'll come on to that. But we had this middle bit with this extended sort of chase, which what felt like sort of Conan on safari, basically. And it felt like one encounter after another with various local animals, flora and fauna. And I'm not quite sure if it was because of this curse that seemed to be implied throughout, that Conan had this curse placed upon him by the priest, which basically put a big sort of sign above him saying, eat this guy. So we get a fight with a lion, with a crocodile, with a snake, with a spider, with a wolf, with a bear, with a, I might be exaggerating a bit there, but that's what it felt like. Every few pages, Conan is hacking some poor creature's leg off or something in quite graphic ways. And I don't know, it's a strange thing because you read in these stories, I mean, Howard certainly never shied away from gore and being very graphic in his description of sword fights and battles. But somehow, when it's a sort of animal that's being hacked to death in a very graphic way, I don't know, I didn't enjoy that so much. Another issue I have, which I kind of sympathise with a little bit, is, say, we've got all these different cultures mixing together. And so, of course, when they encounter each other, they don't necessarily speak the same language. And one thing Conan is known for in the original stories is his ability to pick up languages very quickly. So we get the sort of, I guess you describe it as Pidgin English or Pidgin Stygian. That's not easy to say. Pidgin Stygian. And I just felt a little bit uncomfortable that there was quite a bit of, me go there now, you stay here, me hunt buffalo. It put me in mind of some of that sort of 50s and 60s kind of stuff, those depictions of native people. I do sympathise because this is one of the difficulties with fantasy or sword and sorcery. How do people communicate? I mean, I got around it in my books by having this sort of trader tongue or trading tongue. I figured if people were trading with each other, they'd need some way to communicate. So that was my crowbar attempt in order to be able to get people from different cultures to communicate. So to be fair to Stirling, that is a difficult one, but I found it a little bit, me Tarzan, you Jane, that kind of feel. I mentioned the day-to-day living thing as a positive, which it was to an extent, but I also felt that maybe went a little bit too far. And in particular, I can think of 3 occasions where we see Conan having a wee. He's having a Jimmy Riddle off the side of a cliff, or is peeing up the side of a hut or something. And I don't know, again, that didn't really sit right with me. Now, I know in Sword and Sorcery, we don't have these heroic figures. We don't have chivalrous knights doing battle. These are gritty, down-to-earth barbarians and fighting men and women, They live by the skill of their sword and the sweat of their brow. So it's not that I object to that as such, but to me, it just didn't fit right in a Conan story. Now, I mentioned the fight scenes with the animals earlier on. Of course, we get fight scenes between humans as well. And this was something else that fell a little bit flat for me. One thing that Howard was known for was his dynamic and vibrant action scenes. That man could write a fight. You really felt like you were there. It's very vivid, very visceral. That may be because Howard himself was a boxer. He had an interest in guns and swords and all that kind of stuff. And that's something that I think myself, as an experienced martial artist, who's someone who's been involved in various activities, I think that's something that when you have that experience, you can bring that to the page. So I don't know anything, as I said, about S.M. Stirling. Perhaps he has that experience, but I just felt that the fight scenes lacked a little something. I also mentioned earlier this idea of Lovecraft and Smith and Howard, their fiction overlapping. We get little references to each other, to things like the Necronomicon or now Sprechlichen Colton, and it was Smith who invented Sarthogua that they both used, of course. So we do get that crossover. And I think another thing in this is there's not so much of the weird element, which really is a staple of Howard's style of sword and sorcery. we get this sort of odd little cameo appearance near the end of a Cthulhu type creature with a squid head and bat wings. And there's a couple of nods throughout, or a couple of mentions of elder gods or older gods, but none of that weirdness really comes across in the plot. There's no real sense of it throughout the story. As I said, it seems more like there's this curse and every animal that Conan meets is going to try and bite his face off. So that's pretty much the story. I won't go into detail about the sort of endings and how it all finishes, because I don't want to put any spoilers out. Though, of course, if you're familiar with Red Nails, you'll get some idea of what has happened. The story does blend very nicely into the start of Red Nails. It does give a sort of seamless flow from one into the other. But as I said, I think it does suffer from being right up against Red Nails, and you can directly compare the two. Red Nails was actually the last Conan story that Howard wrote, and I think it's one of his finest. It's certainly a very grim tale where Conan and Valeria find themselves in this sort of enclosed city. It's almost like a sort of Gormenghast type place, and this city is the battleground between two feuding tribes, and the feud has been going on for decades and decades, and it is very grim and brutal. So it's a great story that mixes in all sorts of elements, like a haunted castle. You've got that feuding element. There's something lurking in the crypts below, shall we say. Anyway, I highly recommend that as one of the best Conan stories. And as I said, if you can get hold of that Barry Windsor Smith adaptation, that really is a gorgeous adaptation of it as well. So overall, I enjoyed reading this, apart from that middle section, which I felt did drag a bit. There's not a lot of it that stayed with me. I don't know that I'd particularly want to read it again. There was some nice language in there. There was some good writing in there. The characters felt vivid and real and fleshed out. But as I mentioned, the fight scenes, which in Sword and Sorcery is quite a big thing, right, didn't quite work for me. However, having said all of that, if you are a Howard fan or a Conan fan, then yes, I'd recommend this. It's certainly by far from being the worst adaptation or pastiche out there. Not quite up to the standard of Carl Edward Wagner for me and one or two others, but enjoyable read nonetheless. And I'm glad to see this sort of stuff coming out. I hope there's going to be more to follow. If you've read Blood of the Serpent, then I'd be very interested to hear what you think. Do you agree with my thoughts? Or perhaps you have a different point of view? Do you think it was great? Do you think it was not so good? I'd like to know. So do pop a comment in the notes below. And of course, while you're there, please do like, share and subscribe. And remember, if you are a fan of Howardian Sword and Sorcery, do check out my Wolf Who Would Be King series. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.